Welcome to Eerie Tales for Restful Sleepwear. Soothing rain meets gentle horror for peaceful nights. Subscribe, like, comment, and share to join our brave night owl community. Sleep tight, if you dare. The first encounter. What if the most dangerous thing on the highway isn't what you see but what you don't? Out on the endless blacktop, where the world narrows to a pair of headlights and the steady hum of tires, there are places that seem to swallow the unwary whole. For Dex Keradine, a veteran trucker with more than 2 decades behind the wheel, the road was both a living and a way of life. He'd seen every kind of trouble the interstate could offer: storms, breakdowns, accidents, and the occasional desperate soul waving for help in the middle of nowhere. But nothing in all his years prepared him for what waited at mile marker 247 the night it began. Dex was running a load of freight eastbound on I-40, somewhere between the red dust of Arizona and the distant lights of New Mexico. The highway stretched before him like a black tongue licking at the horizon, the kind of darkness that seemed to press in on the cab, swallowing the world outside the reach of his headlights. The only company was the low, rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine and the faint crackle of the CB radio, where other drivers traded warnings about speed traps and weather, their voices fading in and out like ghosts. Dex had always preferred the silence. After 23 years on the road, he'd learned that the less you said, the less you had to regret. The cab of his truck was a world unto itself, a battered thermos of coffee, a dog-eared atlas, and the steady, familiar weight of the steering wheel beneath his hands. Out here, time stretched and folded in strange ways. Hours could pass in a blink or drag on forever, depending on the mood of the road. It was early November, the air sharp with the promise of winter, when Dex first saw her. He was coming up on mile marker 247, a stretch of highway he'd driven 100 times before, when the flash of hazard lights caught his eye. A white Honda Civic sat pulled off on the shoulder, its blinkers pulsing in the twilight like a mechanical heartbeat. The car looked out of place, too clean and new for this battered stretch of desert road. Beside the open hood stood a young woman, her blonde hair catching the last rays of the setting sun. She looked lost, almost fragile, the kind of helpless that made men do stupid things. Her posture was perfect, one hand on the hood, the other clutching her phone, her face turned toward the oncoming traffic with an expression of practiced distress. It was the sort of scene that would have made a lesser man slam on the brakes without thinking. But Dex was not a lesser man. He'd seen too much, learned too many hard lessons about the way the world worked. The CB protocols were clear: help stranded motorists, especially women alone on desolate stretches. But something about the scene made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way she stood there, too perfect in her distress, like a tableau arranged for maximum effect. Or maybe it was just the accumulated cynicism of a man who'd watched the world grow meaner from behind a windshield. He slowed as he passed, his eyes flicking from the woman to the car and back again. The Honda's hood was up, but there was no steam, no sign of a real emergency. The woman didn't wave, didn't try to flag him down. She just stood there waiting, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Dex felt a chill crawl up his spine, the kind that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He reached for the CB, his fingers moving automatically over the worn buttons. Breaker, breaker, this is Road Dog eastbound on I-40. Got a white Honda Civic pulled over at mile 247. Female driver, looks like she needs assistance. Anyone in the area, keep an eye out, over. The radio crackled, but no one answered. Dex watched the car recede in his mirrors, the hazard lights blinking steadily until they vanished around a bend. He kept driving. The image of the woman burned into his mind. There was something about the way she'd stood there, too still, too composed, that didn't sit right. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he'd done the right thing. The highway patrol would be along soon enough. No sense getting involved in something that didn't feel right. But as the miles rolled by, Dex found himself glancing at the clock, counting the minutes since he'd passed the Honda. He thought about the stories he'd heard over the years. Scams, setups, desperate people willing to do anything for a ride or a few dollars. He'd seen it all, or thought he had, but this was different. This felt like a warning, a test he'd barely passed. The night deepened, the desert growing colder and more silent. Dex kept his eyes on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to mile 247. He wondered if the woman was still there, waiting for someone else to stop. He wondered if she was real at all, or just a trick of the fading light and his own tired imagination. He drove on, the miles ticking by like beads on a rosary. The CV stayed quiet, the other drivers lost in their own worlds. Somewhere out there, the woman and her white Honda faded into the darkness, swallowed by the endless road. But Dex couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just brushed up against something dangerous. Something that watched and waited in the spaces between the headlights and the horizon. He told himself it was nothing, just another night on the interstate. But deep down, he knew better, because the road remembers. The road keeps its secrets. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is look away. The pattern emerges. There's a moment on every long drive when the world outside the windshield starts to feel less like a place and more like a memory, but just out of reach. For Dex Keradine, that moment always seemed to come somewhere between the Arizona border and the endless, empty miles of New Mexico. The desert here was a living thing, shifting and restless, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. Dex had spent more than 2 decades learning to read its moods, to trust the instincts that had kept him alive on roads where help was always 100 miles away. But nothing in all those years had prepared him for what began to unfold at mile marker 247. It started as a nagging sense of déjà vu, the kind of feeling that makes you check your mirrors twice and wonder if you've missed a turn somewhere back in the dark. 3 weeks had passed since Dex first saw the white Honda Civic and the woman with the perfect distress, and he'd done his best to put the memory behind him. He told himself it was just another oddity of the road, a story to share over coffee at the next truck stop. But the image lingered, stubborn as a stain, her blonde hair catching the last light, the hazard lights blinking like a warning he couldn't quite decipher. The second time, it was late at night, the kind of night when the desert seems to swallow sound and light alike. Dex was running a load eastbound, the cab filled with the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB. He was tired, but not so tired that he missed the flash of hazard lights up ahead. As he drew closer, his heart began to pound. There it was again, the same white Honda, pulled off on the shoulder at mile marker 247, its blinkers pulsing in the darkness. But this time, the woman standing beside the car was different. She was younger, her hair a darker shade, her posture somehow more desperate. She stood in the same spot, beside the open hood, her face turned toward the oncoming traffic. Dex felt a chill crawl up his spine. The car was identical, down to the license plate, but the woman was not the same. He slowed, pulling his rig over a quarter mile ahead, and sat for a moment, watching in his mirrors. The desert was silent, the only sound the ticking of the engine as it cooled. Dex's mind raced with questions. Was this a coincidence? A trick of the light? Or was something more sinister at work? He climbed down from the cab, boots crunching on the gravel, and started walking back toward the car. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of sage and distant rain. As he approached, Dex felt the old instincts kick in, the ones that had kept him alive in places where the law was just a rumor. He kept his distance, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But when he reached the spot where the car had been, there was nothing. No car, no woman, not even the faintest trace of tire marks in the dust. The only evidence that anything had been there at all was a dark stain on the asphalt, oil maybe, or something else in the lingering scent of exhaust. Dex stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He reached for the CB, his voice steady but tight. "You see anything back there?" he asked, calling out to Polson, a fellow driver running about 10 minutes behind him in a refrigerated unit. "See what?" came the reply, crackling through the static. "Broken down car. Mile 247 negative. Good buddy. Road's clear." Dex stared at the empty shoulder, the darkness pressing in on all sides. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He'd seen the car, seen the woman, but now there was nothing. No sign that anyone had ever been there at all. He walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and sat in silence, staring at the road ahead. The desert seemed to close in around him, the stars overhead cold and indifferent. He tried to shake off the feeling, to tell himself it was just fatigue, just the tricks the mind plays after too many hours behind the wheel. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The next few days passed in a blur of miles and monotony. Dex delivered his load, picked up another, and kept moving, trying to outrun the memory of what he'd seen. But the road has a way of circling back on itself, of bringing you face to face with the things you'd rather forget. The third time, it was December, and the desert had changed. Snow dusted the ground, turning the landscape into a study in contrast, white against red earth, silence against the endless hum of the highway. Dex was running another late load, the kind that paid extra for speed and discretion. He told himself he wouldn't look, that he'd keep his eyes on the road and his mind on the delivery. But as he approached mile 247, he felt the old tension building in his chest, a sense of inevitability that made his hands tighten on the wheel. And there it was again, the white Honda Civic, pulled off on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in the cold afternoon light. But this time, the woman beside the car was different again. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a tight ponytail, and she wore a red sweater that made her stand out against the winter-bleached desert like a wound. Dex saw her from 2 miles out, a splash of color in the gray landscape, and felt his pulse quicken. He downshifted, the air brakes hissing as he slowed the rig. The engine ticked as it cooled, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Dex sat for a moment in the cab, watching the woman in his side mirror. She wasn't looking at his truck, wasn't flagging him down. She just stood there, her posture rigid, her face turned away from the road. He told himself to keep driving. He told himself it was none of his business. But the mathematics of coincidence didn't support this. 3 times, same car, same spot, different women. The odds were impossible. Something was happening here, something that didn't fit any pattern Dex had ever seen. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The CB handset swung from his belt, and his other hand found the folding knife clipped to his pocket, thumb tracing the familiar groove in the handle. 23 years on the road had taught him that. Preparation was the difference between going home and not going home. The woman looked up as he approached. She was in her mid-20s, pretty in a way that spelled trouble for men with daughters. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were wide with what looked like genuine fear, but the fear seemed practiced, rehearsed, as if she'd spent hours in front of a mirror perfecting the look. "Car trouble?" Dex asked, stopping 10 feet away. I don't know what's wrong with it, she said, her voice carrying a slight accent. Oklahoma, maybe Kansas. It just died. I was driving along and it just stopped. She gestured helplessly at the engine, the movement too perfect, too cinematic. Dex moved closer and looked under the hood. The engine was cold, stone cold, like it hadn't been running in hours. He placed his palm against the radiator housing. No residual warmth, no heat signature at all. How long you been here? He asked. Maybe 20 minutes. I tried calling for help, but there's no signal. She held up her phone, a gesture of modern helplessness that rang as false as a $3 bill. Dex straightened up slowly, never taking his eyes off her face. 20 minutes, huh? This engine hasn't run today. Maybe not yesterday. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Radiators cold as winter stone. Oil settled. Battery terminals got corrosion that takes weeks to build up. For a moment, the helpless mask slipped, and underneath he saw something calculating and predatory. Then the mask snapped back into place. I don't understand what you mean, she said. I mean you're lying, Dex replied, his voice flat. And I've seen this exact same setup twice before, at this exact same spot. So either you're part of some kind of scam, or something real strange is happening here. The woman backed toward the car, her eyes darting to the empty highway. I think you should leave me alone. I think I should too, Dex said, turning and walking back to his truck. But he didn't drive away. Instead, he pulled forward another 100 yards and parked where he could watch the shoulder in his mirrors. He waited, the engine idling, the heater blowing warm air across his face. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the ground. Then, as if conjured from the desert itself, a black SUV materialized on the horizon. It pulled up behind the Honda, its windows tinted so dark Dex couldn't see inside. Two men got out, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had never been prey. They spoke briefly with the woman. Then all three got into the SUV. One of the men stayed behind long enough to push the Honda further off the road, into a shallow depression that made it invisible from the highway. Then they were gone. Dex sat in his cab for a long time, the diesel rumbling beneath him like a sleeping beast. He'd hauled freight through every kind of bad country meth labs in Arkansas hollows, human trafficking routes along the Mexican border, chop shops in Detroit industrial districts. He knew the smell of wrongness, the particular electromagnetic signature that preceded violence. This had that smell, thick and metallic like copper pennies in fear. The CB crackled with evening chatter, drivers reporting deer on the road near Winslow, weather moving in from the west. The mundane concerns of honest men doing honest work. Dex listened to their voices and felt the weight of what he'd witnessed settling in his chest like a stone. He drove into Flagstaff as the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert the color of dried blood. He found a truck stop with internet access and a coffee shop that stayed open late. He ordered black coffee and stale pie and spent 3 hours hunched over a computer terminal, researching missing persons reports for the I-40 corridor. What he found chilled him to the bone. There were more cases than he wanted to see: young women, mostly traveling alone. Cars found abandoned or never found at all. The reports stretched back to years. Scattered across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Always the same pattern. Always the same description. Pretty alone, vanished. The names blurred together after a while. Rebecca Martinez, aged 23, last seen at a gas station in Gallup. Bethany Kowalski, aged 25, found dead in a ravine near Albuquerque. Cause of death undetermined. Amanda Chin, aged 22, never found. Car discovered burning on a side road outside Tucumcari. Dex read until his eyes burned, memorizing faces from driver's license photos. Young faces, hopeful faces, faces that trusted the world to be better than it was. He left the truck stop just before dawn, the sky a pale wash of gray over the desert. As he climbed back into his rig, Dex felt the weight of what he'd learned pressing down on him. He'd stumbled onto something big, something organized, something evil. And he knew, with a certainty that made his hands shake, that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next time he passed mile marker 247, he'd be ready. He'd bring a camera. He'd bring backup. He'd bring whatever it took to shine a light into the darkness that waited on that lonely stretch of road. But for now, all he could do was drive, the miles ticking by beneath his wheels. The road stretching out ahead of him like a question with no answer. Because some places on the highway aren't just dangerous, they're hungry. And at mile marker 247, something was always watching. The horrifying truth unfolds there. Are moments in life when the world you thought you knew cracks open, and something cold and ancient stares back at you from the darkness. For Dex Keradine, that moment came in the flickering light of a truck stop diner. Hunched over a battered computer terminal, the taste of burnt coffee lingering on his tongue. The road had always been his refuge, a place where the rules were simple and the dangers, though real, were at least familiar. But now, as he scrolled through page after page of missing persons reports, Dex realized he'd stumbled into something far stranger and far more terrifying than anything he'd ever faced behind the wheel. The night outside was absolute. The kind of darkness that seemed to press against the windows, eager to seep inside. The truck stop was nearly empty. Just a few other drivers nursing their own secrets over plates of greasy eggs and cold hash browns. Dex's hands hovered over the keyboard, his fingers stiff from hours of searching. He'd started with a simple query: missing women, I-40, Arizona, but the results had multiplied like a virus. Each new link opening a door to another story, another face. Another life cut short or vanished without a trace. He found the first report almost by accident. Rebecca Martinez, 23, last seen at a gas station in Gallup, New Mexico. Her car, a white Honda Civic, had been found abandoned on a side road. The keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat. No sign of struggle, no witnesses, no explanation. The police report was thin, just a few paragraphs of official language and a grainy photo of a young woman with dark hair and a shy smile. Dex felt a chill crawl up his spine. The details matched too closely to what he'd seen at mile marker 247. He clicked through to the next report. Bethany Kowalski, 25, found dead in a ravine near Albuquerque. Cause of death undetermined. Her car, also a white Honda, had been discovered a mile away, hidden in a stand of scrub oak. The report mentioned no obvious signs of foul play, but Dex knew better. He'd seen enough in his years on the road to recognize the signs of something carefully staged, something meant to look like an accident or a simple case of someone running away. He kept reading, the names and faces blurring together in his mind. Amanda Chin, 22, never found. Car discovered burning on a side road outside Tucumcari. Jessica Lee, 24, last seen at a rest stop near Holbrook. Her car was never recovered. The pattern was unmistakably young women, traveling alone, vanishing along the same stretch of highway. Sometimes their cars were found, sometimes not. Sometimes there were bodies, sometimes only rumors and unanswered questions. Dex leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry insects, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but he forced himself to keep going. He started cross-referencing the cases, looking for connections, dates, locations, vehicle descriptions. The more he dug, the more the coincidences piled up, until they no longer felt like coincidences at all. He found a forum for truckers, a place where drivers swapped stories and warnings about dangerous stretches of road. Buried in a thread about I-40, he found a post that made his blood run cold. Anyone else seen the white Honda at 247? 3 times in the last month. Different girls, same car. Feels wrong. Be careful out there, boys. The replies were a mix of skepticism and nervous jokes, but a few other drivers chimed in with their own stories. Saw her last week, blonde, crying by the side of the road. Didn't stop. Something about her eyes. Another wrote, I pulled over, but she was gone by the time I got out. Car 2, like she vanished into thin air. Dex's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't alone. Other drivers had seen it too, had felt the same sense of unease, the same instinct to keep moving. But no one seemed to know what was really happening, or if they did, they weren't saying. He dug deeper, searching for news. Articles, police bulletins, anything that might shed light on the mystery. He found a local news story from 2 years earlier about a string of disappearances along the I-40 corridor. The reporter had interviewed a detective from the Arizona State Police who spoke in careful, measured tones about an ongoing investigation and no evidence of a serial perpetrator. But the subtext was clear. Something was happening out there. Something the authorities couldn't explain or didn't want to admit. Dex scrolled through the comments section, where the real story often lived. It's the cartel, one person wrote. They're snatching girls for trafficking. Another claimed it was a cult sacrificing women to the desert gods. A third insisted it was just bad luck, the kind of thing that happened when people weren't careful. But Dex knew better. He'd seen the look in the woman's eyes, the way she played her part with the precision of an actress. He'd seen the black SUV, the men who moved with the confidence of predators. This wasn't random. This was a system, a machine built to harvest the vulnerable and the unwary. He started mapping the disappearances, plotting them on a digital map. The pattern was unmistakably a cluster of cases centered around mile marker 247, radiating outward in a web of vanished lives. The same stretch of road, the same type of victim, the same eerie silence from the authorities. Dex felt a cold rage building inside him. He thought about all the times he'd driven past a stranded motorist, all the times he'd told himself it was safer not to get involved. He wondered how many lives might have been saved if someone had stopped, if someone had asked the right questions, if someone had refused to look away. He closed his eyes, the faces of the missing women flickering behind his eyelids. He saw Rebecca Martinez, smiling shyly for the camera. He saw Bethany Kowalski, her eyes bright with hope. He saw Amanda Chin, her face half hidden by a curtain of hair. He saw them all, lined up along the edge of the highway, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care. The anger gave way to something colder, something harder. Dex wasn't a hero. He wasn't a cop or a vigilante. He was just a man with a truck and a conscience that wouldn't let him rest. But he knew, with a certainty that bordered on obsession, that he couldn't ignore what he'd found. Not anymore. He started making notes, compiling everything he'd learned into a file on his laptop. He saved screenshots of the forum posts, the news articles, the police reports. He wrote down the names, the dates, the locations. He made a list of questions. Who was behind this? How were they choosing their victims? What happened to the women after they disappeared? He thought about the black SUV, the men who had taken the woman away. He thought about the way the car had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. He thought about the silence on the CB, the way the other drivers had looked the other way. Dex knew he was in over his head. He knew that whatever was happening, At mile marker 247 was bigger and darker than anything he'd ever faced. But he also knew he couldn't walk away. Not now, not after what he'd seen. He spent the rest of the night in the truck stop, watching the door, half expecting the men from the SUV to walk in at any moment. He kept his phone close, his knife closer. He didn't sleep. He didn't dare. As dawn broke over the desert, Dex made a decision. The next time he passed mile marker 247, he wouldn't just be a witness. He'd be ready. He'd bring a camera, maybe even a friend. He'd find out what was really happening on that lonely stretch of road, no matter what it cost him. He packed up his things, paid for his coffee, and walked out into the cold morning air. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun just beginning to rise over the distant mountains. Dex climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before him, endless and indifferent. But Dex was different now. He was no longer just a driver, no longer just a man passing through. He was a witness, a collector of secrets, a man with a mission as the miles rolled by. Dex kept glancing in his mirrors, half expecting to see the white Honda, the black SUV, the woman in the red sweater. But the road was empty, the desert silent. For now, but Dex knew the truth. He knew that somewhere out there, the machine was still running, still hungry, still waiting for its next victim. And he knew, with a certainty that made his hands shake, that he was the only one who could stop it. He drove on, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him like a physical thing. The faces of the missing women haunted him, their eyes following him through the darkness. He promised them, silently, that he wouldn't forget, that he wouldn't look away, that he would do whatever it took to bring the truth into the light. Because some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Some truths demand to be told, no matter the cost. And at mile marker 247, the cost was measured in lives. The trap is set. There are moments when the world seems to hold its breath, when every sound and shadow feels charged with meaning. For Dex Keradine, the days after his night of research at the truck stop were filled with that kind of tension, a sense that something was about to break, that the road itself was waiting for him to make his move. He drove his routes with a new kind of vigilance, eyes flicking constantly to the mirrors, mind replaying every detail of what he'd learned. The faces of the missing women haunted him, their stories looping through his thoughts like a warning he couldn't ignore. He changed his routine, taking loads that kept him away from I-40 for a while, telling himself he needed time to think, to plan. But the truth was, he was afraid. Not just of what he might find at mile marker 247, but of what it would mean if he did nothing. The knowledge pressed on him like a physical weight, a debt he couldn't pay off with silence or distance. Every time he tried to sleep, he saw the white Honda, the woman in the red sweater, the black SUV sliding out of the desert like a shadow with teeth. 2 weeks passed. Dex grew restless, his nerves stretched thin by the constant sense of unfinished business. He started having dreams, vivid, unsettling visions of the desert at night, headlights sweeping over empty roads, faces appearing in the darkness only to vanish when he tried to focus on them. Sometimes he woke with the taste of blood in his mouth, the echo of a woman's scream fading into the sound of the engine idling outside his window. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever. The road was calling him back, and this time he would be ready. Dex prepared for his return to mile marker 247 with the same methodical care he used for every dangerous job. He bought a new camera, small enough to fit in his coat pocket but powerful enough to capture faces and license plates in the dark. He checked his truck from top to bottom, making sure everything was in working order: tires, brakes, lights, the hidden compartment where he kept his old service pistol, a relic from a life he rarely talked about. He packed extra food and water, a first aid kit, and a burner phone with the numbers of local law enforcement programmed in. He told no one where he was going, not his dispatcher, not the other drivers he sometimes shared coffee with at rest stops. This was his burden, his secret. He didn't want to risk anyone else getting caught up in whatever was happening out there. The night he set out, the sky was clear and cold, the stars sharp as broken glass. Dex drove with the windows cracked, letting the chill keep him alert. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional pair of headlights sweeping past in the opposite direction. He kept the radio off, preferring the silence, the better to listen for anything out of place. As he approached mile marker 247, Dex felt his heart start to race. The desert on either side of the road was a study in emptiness, the kind of landscape that made you feel small and exposed. He slowed the truck, scanning the shoulder for any sign of the white Honda, any flash of hazard lights in the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Just the endless ribbon of asphalt, the faint glow of the dashboard, the steady thrum of the engine. Dex forced himself to breathe, to keep his hands steady on the wheel. He passed the marker, eyes flicking to the side of the road, half expecting to see nothing but empty space. But then, just beyond the bend, he saw it, a white Honda Civic, pulled off on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in the cold night air. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. It was exactly as he remembered, down to the angle of the car, the way it sat slightly askew on the gravel. Beside the car stood a woman, her hair a dark auburn that caught the light from his headlights. She wore a heavy coat, her posture hunched against the cold. Even from a distance, Dex could see that she was crying, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. He pulled the truck over a quarter-mile ahead, parking where he could watch the scene in his mirrors. He sat for a moment, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to leave this place and never look back. But he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he'd learned. Dex took the camera from his coat pocket, checked the battery, and slipped it into his hand. He climbed down from the cab, boots crunching on the frozen gravel, breath steaming in the cold air. The night was silent except for the distant hum of the engine and the faint sound of the woman's sobs. He walked slowly, keeping to the edge of the road, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The woman didn't look up as he approached, her face hidden behind a curtain of hair. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "My car broke down. I've been here for hours. Nobody will stop." Dex stopped 10 feet away, keeping his distance. "I'll stop," he said quietly. "Question is, what happens after I stop?" The woman's eyes flicked up wide and red-rimmed. For a moment, Dex thought the fear was real. But then he saw it, the calculation behind the desperation, the way her gaze kept darting past him. Scanning the darkness behind his shoulder, he turned slowly, knowing what he would see. The black SUV was already there, pulled up silent as a hearse. 2 men got out, big men, the kind who wore violence like a uniform, who moved with the unhurried confidence of predators. "Problem here?" the larger man asked, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. He smiled as he spoke, showing teeth that were too white, too straight. "No problem," Dex replied, keeping his voice calm. "Just helping a lady with car trouble." "Appreciate that," the big man said. "We got it covered now." Dex saw the man's coat hang open, despite the cold, the glint of a shoulder holster beneath. The second man was circling around behind him. Standard intimidation pattern: box him in, control his movement, limit his options. Dex had seen it before. In truck stop parking lots, when discussions about loads and money went sideways. He kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed, but his mind was racing. "Funny thing," Dex said, not moving. "I've seen this exact same car break down at this exact same spot 3 times now." Different ladies each time. All pretty, all helpless, all lying. The big man's smile didn't waver. Sounds like you've been paying too much attention to things that ain't your business. Could be, Dex replied, his hand inching toward his knife. Or could be you boys are running some kind of game here. Question is, what kind of game? The second man spoke from behind him, his voice low and cold. The kind that pays real well. The kind where people pay good money to watch things happen. To pretty girls who break down in inconvenient places. Dex felt the world shift beneath his feet. Not a scam, something worse, much worse. He thought of the missing women, the abandoned cars, the faces in the police reports. He thought of the forum posts, the rumors, the silence from the authorities. The big man's smile widened. Of course, sometimes we get complications. Good Samaritans who ask too many questions. Truckers who think they're heroes. That's when we expand the product line. The second man added, Good Samaritan goes wrong. Very popular genre. Pays triple. The woman with auburn hair had stopped crying. She was filming with her phone, the lens tracking their conversation like a hungry eye. Dex looked around at the empty desert, the endless highway, the vast indifferent sky. No traffic in either direction, no witnesses, just him and them and the wind carrying the scent of snow and sage. The isolation was complete, perfect, exactly what they'd planned. He thought about the missing women, Rebecca Martinez, Bethany Kowalski, Amanda Chinol, the names without faces. All the faces without futures. How many had stood in this exact spot, feeling this exact moment of realization? How many had understood, in their final minutes, that they'd been chosen not for who they were, but for how little they would be missed? So what happens now? Dex asked, his voice steady. Now you get to be the star of your own private show, the big man said. His smile never wavered. Don't worry, it'll be over quick. Most of our clients prefer the illusion of struggle, but they don't have the stomach for anything too realistic. Most, Dex asked, stalling for time. Some pay premium for the real thing, the big man replied, his eyes going flat dead. You'd be surprised what people will pay to watch, what they'll pay to participate in. The second man moved closer. Dex could smell aftershave and gun oil, the scent of a man who took pride in his work. Behind him, the woman with auburn hair was still filming, the lens tracking every movement. Tell me something, Dex said, keeping his voice conversational. You boys ever serve? What's that matter? The big man replied, but his stance shifted slightly at Tell. A crack in the professional facade. Just curious, Dex said. See, I did 2 tours in the sandbox. Learned some things over there. About survival, about violence, about the difference between predators and prey. The wind picked up, carrying snow across the highway like salt across a wound. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called their wild sound free. One thing I learned, Dex continued, is that predators make assumptions about prey. They assume weakness, assume fear, assume compliance. The big man's hand moved toward his jacket. That's real interesting. But Dex's hand moved faster than thought. The folding knife came open as it cleared his belt. He spun and drove it deep into the soft spot below the second man's sternum, angling upward toward the heart. The man made a sound like air escaping from a tire and folded. The big man was already moving, pulling something from inside his jacket. Dex lunged for the dying man's gun, but the big man's first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second shot went wide as Dex rolled behind the Honda. Blood ran down his arm, hot against the cold air. The shoulder was on fire, but still worked. He'd been lucky. In the desert, luck was the difference between living and dying, The big man came around the car's front end, and Dex put 2 round center mass into his chest. The reports echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The woman with the auburn hair was screaming, still filming. Dex walked over and took her phone. The screen showed a live stream in progress, 47 viewers. Chat messages scrolling past in multiple languages. "Where's the rest stop?" Dex demanded. "What rest stop?" she stammered. "The one where you take them. The one with the cameras and the paying customers." "I don't know what you're talking about." Dex showed her the gun. "Lady, I just killed 2 men. Killing a third won't change my day much." She broke. 2 miles north, old mining road. There's a sign says no trespassing. How many people? I don't know. 5, maybe 6, plus the clients. What clients? They come to watch in person. Pay extra for front row seats. Dex looked at the phone screen. The viewer count was climbing. Chat messages getting more excited. "Tell them it's over," he said. "What?" "Tell your viewers the show's canceled." The woman shook her head. "I can't. They'll kill me. Lady, everybody dies. Question is how and when and what it means." Dex ejected the magazine from the dead man's gun, checked the load, slammed it back home. "Right now, you got 2 choices. Help me shut this down clean, or I'll leave you here with these bodies and let the desert sort it out." She looked at the bodies, at the blood steaming in the cold air, at the endless empty highway. "The mining road," she said. "There's a gate. Combination is 4739. What's your name?" "Cassie." "Real name?" "Jennifer Walsh, from Phoenix." "How long you been doing this?" "Jennifer, 6 months. They said it was just acting, that nobody got hurt." "People believe what they need to believe," Dex said, pocketing the phone. "Stay here. Anyone comes down that road, you tell them there's been an accident. You understand?" Jennifer nodded, her face pale and drawn. Dex dragged the bodies off the road and into the brush, covering them with rocks and sage. The blood on the asphalt would wash away with the next rain. In this country, that might be months. He drove north on the mining road, the truck bouncing over ruts and rocks, the pain in his shoulder growing with every mile. The road wound up into rocky hills dotted with abandoned mine shafts and rusted equipment. After a mile, he saw lights ahead, a building that looked like a converted mining office. Generator-powered satellite dishes on the roof. Several expensive cars parked outside. Through the windows, he could see figures moving around what looked like camera equipment. Dex's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped. He'd wrapped it with his shirt, but the fabric was already soaked through. Time was running short. Blood loss would make him sloppy. And sloppy got you killed. He parked his truck and approached the building from the side, using the shadows for cover. Through a window, he counted 6 people inside, 3 clients in expensive suits watching monitors. 2 camera operators, 1 man who looked like security standing by the door with his hand resting on a holstered pistol. Dex circled to the back of the building, found a service entrance, tried the hand. He slipped inside and found himself in a storage room filled with camera equipment and computer servers. The main room was through a doorway ahead. He could hear voices, laughter, the sound of men enjoying themselves. The security man was the first to die. Dex came up behind him and opened his throat with a knife. The man went down quiet, blood pooling on the concrete floor. The first client turned as Dex entered the main room. "Who are you?" "Cleanup crew," Dex said, and shot him in the chest. The room erupted, men shouting, diving for cover, scrambling for weapons that weren't there. Dex moved methodically, deliberately. 1 shot per target, no wasted ammunition. The camera operators died trying to run. The remaining clients died begging. When it was finished, he leaned against the wall and tried to breathe through the pain. His shirt was soaked with blood now. The room spun slightly when he moved too fast. He needed medical attention, but that would have to wait. Dex gathered up the computer equipment with his good arm and loaded what he could into his truck. The hard drives and servers went in first: evidence, records, customer lists. Everything that could connect paying clients to missing women. He found gasoline in the generator shed and soaked the building, working one-handed. The fire would burn for hours, hot enough to erase DNA, fingerprints, dental records. By morning, there would be nothing left but ash and melted metal and the scattered bones of evil men. He drove back to where he'd left Jennifer. She was sitting in the Honda crying again. Real tears this time. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over. What happens to me?" Dex looked at her for a long moment. Young enough to be his daughter, old enough to know right from wrong. "You disappeared," he said, "tonight. Forever. New name, new life, new everything. And if I ever see your face again, anywhere for any reason, I'll finish what they started." Jennifer nodded and got out of the Honda, started walking east along the highway, her red coat bright against the darkness. Dex watched until she disappeared, then got back in his truck. He had a load to deliver in Amarillo, a schedule to keep, miles to cover before dawn. The road stretched ahead of him like a black tongue, tasting the darkness. In his mirrors, flames rose from the hills like prayers to an indifferent God. The CB radio crackled with distant voices reporting weather and road conditions. The eternal conversation of men who lived between the lines on a mapped mile marker. 247 fell behind him and was swallowed by the night. He would not see it again for 3 weeks. When he did, the shoulder would be empty, clean. Just another stretch of highway leading nowhere in particular. The desert kept its secrets well. It always had. It always would. The shocking revelation there are truths that change you the moment you see them. Truths that can't be unlearned, no matter how much you wish you could go back to the world you knew before. For Dex Keradine, the night he stormed the mining office in the Arizona hills was the night the world changed forever. He'd always known the road could be dangerous, that evil sometimes wore a human face. But he'd never imagined the scale, the cold calculation, or the hunger that drove the machine he'd uncovered at mile marker 247. The fire he set in the hills burned for hours, a beacon in the desert night. Dex watched from a distance, his shoulder throbbing, his shirt soaked with blood, as the flames consumed the evidence of cameras, the computers, the bodies of men who'd made a business out of suffering. He'd loaded what he could into his truck: hard drives, ledgers, a handful of cell phones, anything that might connect the operation to the missing women whose faces haunted his dreams. But he knew, even as he watched the building collapse into embers, that the real horror wasn't in the ashes. It was in the network that stretched far beyond this lonely outpost, in the clients who'd paid to watch. In the silence that had allowed it all to happen, he drove back to the highway. The desert cold and empty around him, the sky a black vault pricked with indifferent stars. Jennifer, if that was her real name, was gone, vanished into the night with nothing but a red coat and a warning to disappear. Dex didn't know if she'd make it, didn't know if she deserved to. He only knew that she was a survivor, and that sometimes survival was the only justice the world had to offer. As he drove east toward Amarillo, Dex replayed the night's events in his mind, searching for meaning in the chaos. He'd killed men before overseas, in places where the rules were different, where violence was currency and survival was a matter of split-second decisions. But this was different. This was America, the land of endless highways and second chances. and the blood on his hands felt heavier than it ever had before. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter weather reports, traffic updates, the low hum of men and women moving freight across the continent. Dex listened, but the words felt distant, irrelevant. He was no longer just a driver, no longer just a man with a schedule and a load to deliver. He was a witness, a participant in something vast and terrible. A man who'd seen the machinery of evil up close and lived to tell the tale. He pulled into a truck stop outside Tucum, the neon lights flickering in the pre-dawn gloom. He parked at the edge of the lot, away from the other rigs, and sat in the cab, staring at the hard drive stacked on the passenger seat. He knew what he had to do. He had to get the evidence to someone who would listen, someone who could use it to bring down the rest of the operation. But he also knew how these things worked. He'd seen it before, the way money and power could make problems disappear, the way victims became statistics, the way the world moved on. He powered up his laptop, connected the first hard drive, and began to sift through the files. What he found was worse than anything he'd imagined. There were folders labeled with dates and locations, lists of names and payment amounts, video files with titles that made his skin crawl. He opened one at random, his hands shaking, and watched as the screen filled with the image of a young woman, terrified and alone, her face lit by the harsh glare of headlights. The video was grainy, the audio muffled, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Dex forced himself to watch, to bear witness. He owed the victims that much. He took notes, copied files, made backups on every device he owned. He found chat logs, transcripts of conversations between clients and operators, requests for specific scenarios, payments made in cryptocurrency, instructions for how to avoid detection. The language was clinical, detached, the language of people who saw suffering as entertainment, who saw human beings as disposable. He found lists of clients' names, email addresses, IP logs. Some were anonymous, hidden behind layers of encryption and fake identities. But some were real, and Dex recognized a few businessmen, politicians, men who'd shaken his hand at charity events, men who'd smiled for the camera and talked about family values. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't just a handful of sick individuals. This was an industry, a network that spanned states, maybe even countries. Dex felt sick. He thought about the women he'd seen on the side of the road, the ones who'd vanished without a trace. He thought about the men who'd watched, who'd paid to see pain and fear and death. He thought about the silence, the way the authorities had looked the other way, the way the world had kept turning. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. But who could he trust? The police? Maybe. The FBI? Maybe. But he'd seen what happened to whistleblowers, to people who tried to bring down powerful men. He'd seen the way evidence disappeared, the way witnesses changed their stories, the way justice was delayed until it was meaningless. He made a decision. He would go public. He would leak the files to every journalist, every activist, every organization that might listen. He would flood the internet with the truth, make it impossible to ignore. He would name names, show faces, force the world to look at what it had allowed to happen. He spent the next 12 hours in the cab of his truck, uploading files, sending emails, making calls. He used burner accounts, encrypted messengers, every trick he'd learned in a lifetime of staying off the radar. He sent the evidence to national news outlets, to watchdog groups, to anyone who might have the courage to run with it. He knew it was dangerous. He knew he was painting a target on his back. But he didn't care. Not anymore. As the sun set over the desert, Dex sat in the cab, exhausted, his shoulder throbbing, his mind racing. He watched the news on his phone, waiting for the story to break. At first, there was nothing. Just the usual headlines, politics, sports, the endless churn of the news cycle. But then, slowly, the story began to spread. A local station in Albuquerque ran a segment on the disappearances. A national paper picked up the thread, connecting the dots. Social media exploded with speculation, outrage demands for answers. The authorities couldn't ignore it anymore. The FBI announced an investigation. State police set up checkpoints along I-40. The governor held a press conference, promising justice for the victims. Names were named, faces shown, secrets dragged into the light, but Dex knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The network was too big, too entrenched. For every site they shut down, another would spring up. For every client they arrested, 10 more would slip through the cracks. The machine was wounded, but it wasn't dead. He watched as the story spread, as the world reacted with shock and horror. He saw the faces of the missing women on the evening news, their names finally spoken aloud, their stories finally told. He saw the outrage, the calls for justice, the promises of reform. But he also saw the cynicism, the disbelief, the way some people tried to explain it away, to pretend it wasn't real. Dex knew better. He knew that evil didn't die in the light. It just went underground, changed its shape, waited for the world to look away again. He drove on, the road stretching out before him, the desert silent and watchful. He kept the hard drives hidden, backups stashed in places no one would think to look. He kept his head down, his eyes open, his hand close to the pistol in his coat. He knew they would come for him sooner or later. The men who'd built the machine, the men who'd paid to watch, the men who couldn't afford to let the truth stand. But Dex wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He'd seen the worst the world had to offer, and he'd survived. He'd done what he could, and that was enough. He thought about the women he'd tried to save, the ones he couldn't. He thought about Jennifer, walking east along the highway, her red coat bright against the darkness. He wondered if she'd find a new life, or if the past would catch up with her. He wondered if any of them would ever find peace. He knew he wouldn't, not really. The road was his home, his penance, his escape. He would keep driving, keep moving, keep watching, because the world was full of mile markers, full of places where the darkness waited, full of people who needed someone to notice, someone to care. He listened to the CB, the endless conversation of men and women who lived between the lines on a map. He heard the fear in their voices, the hope, the loneliness. He heard the stories they told to keep the darkness at bay. He knew that somewhere out there, the machine was already rebuilding itself, setting new traps, baiting new hooks. He knew that the hunt would begin again, that the road would claim more victims. But he also knew that he'd made a difference, however small. He'd forced the world to look, to see, to remember, and sometimes that was enough. As the miles rolled by, Dex felt the weight of the night lift just a little. The road stretched out before him, endless and indifferent, but he was no longer just a passenger. He was a witness, a survivor, a man who'd faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. He drove on, the engine humming its diesel lullaby, the odometer ticking off the miles like rosary beads. In his mirrors, the flames of the mining office had faded to embers, then to nothing, leaving only stars and darkness and the endless conversation between rubber and road. America slept. The highway dreamed. And somewhere in the distance, a truck driver carried his cargo toward dawn. His conscience as clean as desert wind, his purpose as clear as starlight on stone. The road went on. It always did. It always would. And somewhere, in the darkness, Other predators were already planning their next hunt, setting their next trap, baiting their next hook with desperation and false hope. Because that is what predators do. It is their nature, their purpose, their only truth. But tonight, for the first time in months, no one would disappear at mile marker 247 tonight. The highway belonged to the honest darkness, to the legitimate ghosts, to the clean silence of a world temporarily balanced. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new predators, new prey. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Dex Keradine drove east through the desert with 40,000 pounds of freight and the certain knowledge that some evils could only be stopped with a greater evil, that some problems could only be solved with violence, that some prayers could only be answered with blood. The engine hummed its diesel lullaby. The miles clicked by on the odometer like rosary beads. And in the rearview mirror, the flames died down to embers, then to nothing, leaving only stars and darkness and the endless conversation between rubber and road. America slept. The highway dreamed. And somewhere in the distance, a truck driver carried his cargo toward dawn. His conscience as clean as desert wind. His purpose as clear as starlight on stone. The road went on. It always did. It always would. The final showdown. There are nights when the world seems to hold its breath, when every shadow feels alive and every sound carries a warning. For Dex Keradine, the night he returned to the mining road was one of those nights, a night when the line between hunter and hunted blurred. And the only certainty was that not everyone would see the dawn. The pain in his shoulder was a constant, throbbing reminder of how close he'd come to dying on that lonely stretch of highway. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage, sticky and hot against his skin, but Dex forced himself to ignore it. He had a job to finish, and he knew that hesitation could be fatal. The desert was a place that rewarded decisiveness and punished doubt. Out here, the only law was survival. He drove north on the mining road, the headlights of his rig cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The road twisted and climbed, winding through rocky hills dotted with the rusted skeletons of abandoned equipment. The moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in a cold blue light. Dex's mind raced with possibilities. How many people would be waiting at the compound? How many were armed? How many were just as desperate as he was? He replayed the conversation with Jennifer, if that was her real name, over and over in his mind. The fear in her eyes, the way her voice had trembled when she gave him the combination to the gate. 4,739. He repeated the numbers under his breath like a mantra, willing himself to remember. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. As he approached the gate, Dex killed the headlights and coasted the last 100 yards in darkness. The sign was just as she'd described: no trespassing. Private property, violators will be prosecuted. The gate itself was a heavy metal affair, chained and padlocked. Dex climbed down from the cab, wincing as the pain in his shoulder flared. He entered the combination with his good hand, the lock clicking open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. He pushed the gate open just wide enough to slip through, then closed it behind him. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get help, to call the police and let them handle it. But Dex knew better. He'd seen what happened when you waited for someone else to do the right thing. He'd seen how quickly evidence disappeared, how easily the guilty slipped away. The road beyond the gate was little more than a rutted track, barely wide enough for his truck. He drove slowly, careful to avoid the worst of the potholes. After a mile, he saw lights ahead, a cluster of buildings, low and squat, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Satellite dishes bristled from the roof, and the glow of computer monitors flickered through the windows. Dex parked the truck in the shadows, out of sight of the main building. He took a moment to steady his breathing, to check his weapons. The pistol felt heavy in his hand, the weight of it both reassuring and terrifying. He slipped the camera into his coat pocket, checked the extra magazines, and made sure the knife was still clipped to his belt. He moved through the darkness with the caution of a man who'd spent years learning how to disappear. The desert was silent except for the distant hum of a generator and the occasional bark of a coyote. Dex kept to the shadows, circling the perimeter of the compound, counting windows, doors, possible escape routes. He saw movement inside, figures hunched over computer screens. A man in a suit laughing as he watched something on a monitor. A woman in a headset barking orders into a phone. He found a side entrance. The door propped open to let in the cool night air. He slipped inside, moving quietly through a maze of storage rooms and hallways lined with racks of camera equipment. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, electronics, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the scent of fear. He paused outside a door, listening. Voices drifted through, men and women talking, laughing, the clink of glasses. Dex risked a glance through the crack. The main room was set up like a control center. Banks of monitors displaying live feeds from cameras hidden along the highway, in the desert, inside the compound itself. On one screen, he saw the white Honda, empty now, its hazard lights still blinking. On another, he saw a woman, young, terrified, her face streaked with tears, being led into a room by two men in black. Dex felt a surge of rage, hot and blinding. He forced himself to stay calm, to think. He needed evidence, something that would tie these people to the disappearances. Something that would survive even if he didn't. He pulled out the camera, snapped photos of the monitors, the faces of the operators, the clients lounging on couches with drinks in hand. He moved deeper into the building, searching for the server room. He found it at the end of a hallway, the door locked but the hinges old and rusted. Dex pried it open with the knife, slipped inside, and began pulling hard drives from the racks. He stuffed them into his backpack, working quickly, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Suddenly footsteps echoed in the hallway. Dex froze, listening. Two men, voices low and tense. Did you hear something? Probably just the wind, or one of the girls. Go check it out. I'll stay here. Dex pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding. The first man entered the server room, flashlight sweeping the darkness. Dex waited until the beam passed, then struck, knife flashing, a quick, silent kill. The man crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. The second man called out, "You find anything?" Dex didn't answer. He slipped out of the room, moving quickly down the hall. He could hear shouts now. Someone had found the body. The alarm was spreading. Dex ran, ducking into a storage closet as footsteps thundered past. He waited, counting the seconds, listening to the chaos erupt around him. He heard the woman in the headset screaming orders, the clients demanding to be let out, the operators scrambling to shut down the feeds. Dex knew he had only minutes before the whole place went into lockdown. He slipped out of the closet, moving toward the main room. He saw the woman from the monitoring, terrified, her hands bound behind her back, being dragged toward a waiting SUV. Dex raised the pistol, fired twice. The first shot caught the man in the leg, the second in the chest. The woman screamed, fell to the ground, scrambling away from her captor. Dex ran to her, cutting the zip ties with his knife. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, don't let them take me back." "I won't," Dex promised. "But we have to move now." He led her through the chaos, dodging panicked clients and operators. The building was filling with smokes. Someone had set a fire, either as a distraction or to destroy evidence. Dex coughed, his shoulders screaming with pain, but he kept moving, dragging the woman behind him. They burst out into the night, the compound lit by the flicker of flames. Dex led her to his truck, shoved the hard drives and camera into the cab, and helped her climb inside. He started the engine, gunned it down the rutted road, the headlights bouncing over rocks and potholes. Behind them, the compound burned, the fire consuming everything in its path. Dex didn't look back. He drove with one hand, the other pressed to his bleeding shoulder, the woman sobbing quietly beside him. They reached the highway just as the first sirens wailed in the distance. Dex pulled over, helped the woman out of the truck, and handed her a burner phone. "Call this number," he said, pressing a card into her hand. "Tell them what happened. Give them the evidence. Don't trust anyone who doesn't know the code word Midnight Sun. You understand?" She nodded, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered. Dex watched as she disappeared into the darkness, then climbed back into his truck. He sat for a long moment, head bowed, the pain in his shoulder finally overwhelming him. He knew he needed help, medical attention, a place to hide, a way to disappear until the dust settled, but he also knew he'd done what he could. He'd destroyed the compound, rescued at least one victim, gathered enough evidence to bring the operation down. He'd faced the darkness and survived, if only just. He drove east, the road stretching out before him, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The CB radio crackled with news of the fire, the police response, the rumors spreading through the trucking community. Dex listened, but said nothing. He was a ghost now, a shadow moving through the world, carrying secrets too heavy to share. He thought about the faces of the missing women, the ones he'd saved and the ones he hadn't. He thought about Jennifer, about the clients who would never face justice, about the machine that would rebuild itself in some other place, with some other victims. But for now, the road was quiet. The desert was still, and Dex Keradine, battered and bleeding, was alive. He drove on, the miles ticking by, the sun rising over the horizon. The world was changed, if only a little. The darkness had been pushed back, if only for a night. And somewhere, in the silence between the lines on the map, a truck driver carried his cargo toward dawn, his conscience as clean as the desert wind, his purpose as clear as starlight on stone. The road went on. It always did. It always would. Aftermath and reflection, there are nights that never truly end, even when the sun rises. For Dex Keradine, the aftermath of the showdown at mile marker 247 was one of those nights, a stretch of time that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of days and hours. A liminal space where the world felt both emptier and heavier than before. The desert had always been a place of secrets, but now Dex carried some of those secrets inside him, and he knew they would never fully let him go. He drove east, the sky slowly brightening behind him, the road stretching out like a question with no answer. The pain in his shoulder was a constant companion, a reminder of how close he'd come to joining the ghosts that haunted the I-40 corridor. Blood had soaked through the bandage, sticky and dark, but Dex kept going, mile after mile, refusing to stop until the adrenaline faded and exhaustion took its place. He found a clinic in a small town just across the Texas border, a place that didn't ask too many questions. The nurse was brisk and efficient, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She stitched his wound, gave him antibiotics, and told him to rest. Dex nodded, thanked her, and paid in cash. He knew better than to linger. The world was full of eyes, and he couldn't be sure which ones were watching. For days, Dex kept moving, never staying in one place for long. He delivered his load in Amarillo, signed the paperwork with a steady hand, and accepted another job heading north. The routine of the road was a comfort, a way to lose himself in the familiar rhythms of driving, eating, sleeping, and driving again. But the memories followed him, persistent as the hum of the engine. He watched the news when he could, scanning headlines for any mention of the fire, the raid, the arrests. The story had broken wide, just as he'd hoped. The footage he'd leaked, grainy, horrifying, undeniable, had forced the authorities to act. The FBI had raided the compound, arrested the remaining operators, and rescued several women who'd been held captive. The clients, those who could be identified, were being questioned, their names whispered in the halls of power and privilege. But Dex knew the truth. He knew that for every man arrested, another would slip away. For every victim rescued, another would vanish. The machine was wounded, but it wasn't dead. Evil had a way of surviving, of adapting, of finding new forms and new victims. The world was too big, too complicated, for any one man to fix. He thought about Jennifer, the woman in the red coat, and wondered if she'd managed to disappear, to start over somewhere far from the desert and its ghosts. He thought about the other women, the ones whose faces he'd memorized from missing persons reports, the ones whose stories would never be told. He thought about the men who'd built the machine, who'd profited from pain and fear, and wondered if they would ever truly pay for what they'd done. The road offered no answers, only more questions. Dex found himself driving in silence, the radio off, the sea quiet. He listened to the sound of the tires on the asphalt, the steady thrum of the engine, the wind rattling the windows. He watched the landscape change, desert giving way to plains, mountains rising in the distance, towns flickering past like mirages. The world kept moving, indifferent to the suffering that had played out in its shadows at night. Dex parked his rig at the edge of truck stops, away from the lights and the noise. He sat in the cab, staring out at the darkness, replaying the events of that night over and over in his mind. He remembered the fear in the woman's eyes, the cold confidence of the men in the SUV, the way the fire had lit up the hills like a signal to the gods. He remembered the weight of the pistol in his hand, the taste of blood in his mouth. The moment when he realized that survival sometimes meant becoming the very thing you hated. He wondered if he'd done the right thing. He wondered if there was such a thing as right and wrong in a world where evil could hide in plain sight, where justice was a matter of luck and timing. He wondered if he would ever be able to sleep through the night again, or if the ghosts of mile marker 247 would follow him to the end of the road. But even as the doubts gnawed at him, Dex knew he couldn't have done anything else. He'd seen the darkness, stared it down, and refused to look away. He'd risked his life to save strangers, to bring the truth into the light, to break the cycle of silence and complicity. He'd done what he could, and sometimes that had to be enough. The world didn't change overnight. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies, new distractions. The authorities made promises, held press conferences, launched investigations. But Dex knew that the real work was done in the shadows by people who refused to look away, who refused to let the darkness win. He became a legend among truckers, a story told in hushed tones at truck stops and diners across the Southwest. Some said he was a hero, others a vigilante, others still a ghost who haunted the highways, watching for signs of trouble. Dex didn't care what they called him. He knew who he was, a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, but who still believed that the road could be a place of redemption. He kept driving, kept moving, kept watching. He learned to live with the pain, the memories, the knowledge that the world was darker than he'd ever imagined. He learned to find comfort in small things, the taste of hot coffee at dawn, The sight of a coyote crossing the road, the feel of the steering wheel beneath his hands. He learned that survival was its own kind of victory, that sometimes the best you could do was keep going. He never returned to mile marker 247. The next time he passed that stretch of highway, the shoulder was empty, the desert silent. The only sign that anything had ever happened there was a patch of scorched earth, half hidden by sage and sand. The road kept its secrets, as it always had, as it always would. But Dex carried those secrets with him, a burden and a shield. He knew that somewhere out there, other predators were already planning their next hunt, setting their next trap, baiting their next hook with desperation and false hope. He knew that the fight was never really over, that the darkness was always waiting, just beyond the reach of the headlights. He drove on, the miles ticking by, the world slipping past in a blur of light and shadow. He watched the sun rise over the plains, watched the stars fade into the pale blue of morning. He listened to the CB, the endless conversation of men and women who lived between the lines on a map. He heard the fear in their voices, the hope, the loneliness. He heard the stories they told to keep the darkness at bay, and sometimes, when the night was quiet and the road was empty, Dex allowed himself to hope. He hoped that the evidence he'd gathered would make a difference, that the women he'd saved would find peace, that the men who'd built the machine would face justice. He hoped that the world could change, even if only a little, even if only for a while, but he knew better than to expect miracles. The road was long, and the darkness was patient. All he could do was keep moving, keep watching, keep fighting. Because some debts could only be paid in full, and some sins could only be cleansed with blood. He became a ghost, a rumor, a warning whispered among those who traveled the lonely highways. Some said he was still out there, watching for signs of trouble, ready to step in when the world looked away. Others said he'd disappeared, swallowed by the desert, another casualty of a war that could never be won. But Dex knew the truth. He was still driving, still searching, still refusing to let the darkness win. He was a man with a conscience as clean as desert wind, a purpose as clear as starlight on stone. He was a survivor, a witness, a reminder that sometimes the only thing standing between the innocent and the abyss was a single, stubborn soul who refused to give up. The road went on. It always did. It always would. And somewhere in the silence between the lines on the map, a truck driver carried his cargo toward dawn, his heart heavy with secrets, his eyes open to the darkness, his spirit unbroken by the weight of the world, because in the end, that's all any of us can do: keep moving, keep fighting, keep hoping that the next mile will be a little brighter than the last dot, and for one night, at least the highway belonged to the honest darkness, to the legitimate ghosts, to the clean silence of a world temporarily balanced. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new predators, new prey. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Dex Keradine drove east through the desert, the engine humming its diesel lullaby, the odometer ticking off the miles like rosary beads. In his mirrors, the flames of the past had faded to embers, then to nothing, leaving only stars and darkness and the endless conversation between rubber and road. America slept. The highway dreamed. And somewhere in the distance, a truck driver carried his cargo toward dawn, his conscience as clean as desert wind, his purpose as clear as starlight on stone. The road went on. It always did. It always would.